Welcome to Books Boys, live from the Grand Library, TheDean and PJ. He's PJ.
Hello there.
I'm the Dean, and we are the Books Boys.
The one and only.
This is the Books Boys show. Get it? Buy it? Books. We're joined, of course, by Little Alfred. There he is.
Good Lord.
PJ, it's episode 16. Sweet 16, and we will not comment on our kissing status as the proverbial slang goes. PJ, how are you?
Not. Yeah, very well. I'm in Ireland now, so we're in the same country, but I'm in a very far and secluded forest. Well, not as secluded. So I'm near Galway.
You've gone very far south, but we're going to do a pilgrimage. There's going to be a little pilgrimage, and I'm going to come visit you in the next 2 weeks. So
you are was our mutual friends.
Our mutual friend, Playboy Alex. We're gonna. I don't think he likes that name. We're gonna come down and visit you. So we'll have a little Books Boys excursion. Get some clips from the journey on Instagram. PJ, I think we've done a lot of reading this month, so I feel like we should just get stuck in.
Let's get to it. I'm still confused what they are. I've been reading Toilet Scrolls, trying to decipher the meaning of. Of Harry Potter and the Odyssey and.
I have this one, and it has like it looks like a book, right? It's got covers, it's got papers, it's got lines in it, and then it says, Monday the 24th of January, Tuesday the 25th of January, and there's some spaces. Is this books?
It's a postmodern work on the meaningless of mankind after the Berlin Wall. It's quite a classic.
Yeah, it's called 2022, the postmodern classic. So
yeah, there you go, guys. So get it, buy it.
Get it, buy it, books. Oh, you said the catchphrase.
I took it away from you. All right, guys. So let's get to it.
Get to it. I'll go first.
Can I put on my Irish accent?
Oh, no, you've not been there long enough to pick that up.
Okay. Sorry, guys. Sorry. I'm half Irish, so
he is half Irish, so you're not allowed to be offended.
Half allowed to do that stuff. All right.
Okay. The first book I read, George Eliot, Middlemarch.
I thought you wouldn't finish that book until the middle of March, the way you were talking about it.
Oh, gosh. It took me in the end 2.5 weeks, but I thought it was going to take me the whole month. Like, it felt like 3 months had gone past. I was thinking like, oh my God, I'm going to have nothing to talk about on the show because I'm struggling to get through this one book. Now, to be fair, look, it is 800 pages. It is a long book.
It is considered one of the best books of man and womankind,
I am shocked by this because it's not bad by any means. It's not bad, I should stress. But it's also not brilliant. I mean, Silas Marner was better. I give Silas Marner a glowing review. George Eliot has written good books. The Mill and the Floss, well, the less said the better. But Silas Marner was very good, And this felt like it just didn't need to be 800 pages. Maybe you could have cut it into like a third of that amount, and it would have been a nice little novel. But let me tell you about Middlemarch. Middlemarch is a crazy town where everyone is obsessed with doctors. Okay, that's my main takeaway from this book. My main takeaway is it's a small village. Like, they're all living in these Victorian little towns, and there's like 4 different doctors, and everybody's really concerned about like who your doctor is and how much business the local doctor's getting. And there's not enough business to go around, so let's be very concerned about which doctor you go to when you get ill. Like, I've never. Serious? Yeah, but they've got nothing else going on. They're very, very concerned about the medical man. And there's a banker, Bulstrode, and he's gonna get a hospital built. And it's all very like, which doctors are going to be running the hospital? Is it the physicians or is it the more general practitioner kind? It's a strange concern for the average man, It's just I find
these were
bizarre.
these were Victorian times. Then these were desperate times. Where
Well, yeah, when you're having a medical emergency on a weekly basis, then I guess it does
is.
matter. So we get a good
and
insight.
It's supposed to be a great example of realism. So I think literally instead of talking about cowboys and what have you not, they talk about the average problem of mankind. Probably where you're going to get your next leg operation from, or whatever it was.
My other problem with it is it just has too many stories that eventually intersect, and everyone's got similar names like Lowick and Lydgate and Bulstrode and all these names that are very similar to other names, and it gets a bit confusing. But the good thing is it gives us a lot of interesting Ladislaw and Lowick and Lydgate. I mean, come on, but it gives us an interesting insight into family life. We actually see a lot of couples, and we see some really lovely, caring, lovely couples that are so good to each other. And then we see ones that aren't. And that's the bit that I enjoyed the most. But I'm going to tell you my absolute favorite bit, because it's going to lead into our sponsor, PJ. I've been working on a business enterprise for us this week. So there's a nice bit near the beginning where they play the slang versus poetry card game. So you will say anything, Fred, to gain your point. Well, tell me whether it is slang or poetry to call you a leg platter. Of course, you can call it poetry if you like. Ah, Miss Rosie, you don't know Homer from slang. I shall invent a new game. I shall write bits of slang and poetry on slips and give them to you to separate. And so, dear me, how amusing it is to hear you young people talk. So this is what the youths are working on, PJ. They're separating slang from poetry on little slips of paper. So
tell Monopoly to, go into some other kind of business like buy chips, because this game is going to hit the town very soon.
It is. Guys, slang versus poetry, the card game.gov, and you can get that. That's our sponsor for this month's episode. I need to play that. I really do. But look, we get some similar vibes to the Mill on the Floss, the little family life, and it's a bit depressing at times. Just the usual that you would expect. But we also get some nice things. There's a girl, Mary, and there's a chap, Fred, and they're in love, and it's very nice. And she's not a coquette, but she tries to put him off a lot and play hard to get a little bit, whilst being very virtuous and very lovely. And actually, her family know that she loves him, and they know that he loves her. And her parents kind of try to help out. And the dad gets Fred a job and everything. It's all very nice, But Fred was expecting to inherit a lot of money from a Mr. Featherstone, from some old guy, and he doesn't inherit the money. And Mary feels very bad because as the guy was dying, he says to her, "There's 2 wills. Will you please destroy one?" And she says, "I'm not meddling in this in case I get in trouble." And of course, had she destroyed the will, her fiance would have inherited £10,000. So, she feels bad that she caused that. So that's why they help him out to get a job and things like that. So all the usual goings on. Slang versus poetry and ripping up wills. Just your day-to-day life with about 4 doctors competing for your affections. Just the normal goings on in Victorian England.
That's it.
There's also this chap. So there's this guy. We open the book with 2 sisters, Kitty and Dolly. I know that maybe sounds a little bit Tolstoyan there, but
Dolly.
We have Dolly is Dorothea, okay, and she marries a Mr. Casaubon, who is much, much, much older than her and treats her like crap. He doesn't want a wife. He wants a secretary that he doesn't have to pay. So he does a lot of scholarly pursuits, and he just gets her to mark down his notes. Essentially, that's her life as a wife. And he'll wake her up at 3 a.m. and be like, "I think it's time we mark down some notes." And she just gotta write down some thoughts for him. And even on their honeymoon, he leaves her all day while he goes excavating texts or whatever. And he has a young nephew called Will Ladislaw. And Will forms a bit of a connection with Dorothea, so Will has to go, and he's not allowed back to the house anymore. And when he dies, he actually writes it into the will that his wife will inherit everything as long as she never marries his nephew. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it's the tremendous love story that she wants to marry him anyway and forsake all her riches and all this kind of thing. So there's some romance, and I do like the romance, and it is a good book. It's just a very, very long book, and there's lots of subplots. So we have Lydgate and his wife, Rosamond. And Rosamond doesn't really like him. She's the coquette. And she's Lidgett, I would never have married you if I thought our life was going to be difficult or I thought we were going to be poor. And Lidgett's trying to be a good doctor and not just give people prescriptions they don't need. So because of that, he's not making as much money as the other doctors. So that's why she's saying, I would never have known that. Just do what they're all doing and we'll have more money. And he says, well, we're going to have to sell our fancy plates and cutlery that we bought and maybe some of your jewelry. And she's outraged. I shall go back to my mom and papa because I never thought my husband would make me sell my plates. And she's just outraged by this. And I would never have married you if I'd known we would have to have, not a full set of plates. And she's very, very stuck up. And then she's pregnant. And he tries to be a good doctor and look after her and tell her to look after the baby. And she's off flirting with other men. And she goes horse riding with one of them. And she falls off the horse and she loses the baby. And I think
that's a famous scene, isn't it?
Yeah. She's not distraught at all. She's just like, yeah, whatever, who cares, next. And he's distraught, obviously. And she's just really immature, And then when he tries to bring it up, she's just like, well, I wish I died with the baby. And she's just very emotionally manipulative and making him always feel bad,
It doesn't seem like a very feminist novel coming from a woman.
In some ways, it's not. But Dorothea, although she begins not very feminist, she marries this guy who's not really that. He doesn't abuse her. He's just not a loving husband. With the scholarly one, she becomes a stronger character later in the book. And Mary's very strong with her love Fred because she keeps putting him off and says, I'm not going to marry you if you go into the clergy. I'm not going to marry you if you do something silly. You've got to get yourself straight, get yourself in order. So some of the women are strong. But it is sad to see the likes of this one, Rosie, who's very much the coquette and very much, I'm just going to complain to my husband that he's not good enough all the time. And, I wish I died with the baby and all this kind of stuff. And she doesn't care about the fact that they're struggling financially, about his emotional needs. She's just very much, well, what's in it for me? Constantly,
Okay.
So we get to see good couples and bad couples, and we see some that are so in love, that treat each other so well and always bigging each other up and always complimenting each other and respecting each other. So the parents of Mary are always respecting each other's wisdom and they just really, really good, strong bonds with people who are really in love. And then we also see the reverse. And I guess in a sense that is realist, we get to see the good and the bad side of relationships in this novel.
Yes. That's the whole point of the novel is to show a glimpse of society at the time. So that's the whole point about realism.
Here's our mill on the floss type stuff. There's a scene where Dorothea and Mr. Casaubon have argued. Well, they've not argued. She had tried to assert her own will. And he says, Dorothea, you're trying to use your own intelligence, but I would rather that you just obey me, And she feels so bad that she's upset him that she waits outside his room all the night in case he leaves to get a glass of water or something. And then he wakes up in the night, and sees. It's like the scene with the girl sitting beside her dad's knee,
hoping to have some affection.
Yeah, and eventually he says, were you waiting all night for me? And he says, yes, I did not like to disturb you, And she just waits, and that's supposed to be a happy moment, but I didn't find that level of submission to really be happy,
Oh my God! Okay, good
Lord. Yeah, it's a little bit. It's got the goods and the bads, but look, it's difficult to get with 800 pages and about 4 different families all intersecting. I mean, a lot of the plots don't really tie together, and then near the end they do. It's difficult to give a synopsis, There is a bad chap called Raffles, and Raffles knows some secrets about people. There's some bad blood in Will Ladislaw. He's not as pure as they thought. And he knows the banker Bulstrode was maybe made some of his money through some dodgy means. So we get some tense scenes with, is this guy going to let everyone in on our secrets and do we need to bribe him? And he's a bit of a Dickens character, is Raffles. He's a bit of a slimy Dickensian type character. So we get to see...
Might be a bit amusing to read it.
I think he's there for a little bit of not even comic relief, but just it's something different because all the other people are kind of the same,
Okay. Well, let me tell you about the book I read, Dean. What I read was a bit different to Middlemarch. It's called Omonte Cinco by Paulo Coelho, The Fifth Mountain. Have you ever read some Paulo Coelho?
I honestly, no, I haven't.
So Paulo Coelho is a Brazilian author who's famous for the book The Alchemist, which came out in the late 80s. And he's one of these novelists that are also kind of, let's say they're very much they write self-help books in the form of a novel, or even spiritual books, you may call them. And now The Alchemist is a beautiful novel about a man searching for treasure in Egypt because he had a dream, but really it's about self-discovery, and all the books are about self-discovery, really. So this book takes a story from the Bible about the prophet Elijah, from Kings in the Bible, and it's basically about Elijah's kind of early life before he became a leading prophet. So he was born a prophet in the sense of he heard angels, but the parents didn't want him to hear angels, so they said, "Don't tell anyone, because suppose if you could hear angels, you would then be a prophet and then be part of the government," and they didn't want that. But at some point, the angel, I think he has an angel, a constant angel, but then he has an angel of God visiting him at one point. He's working as a carpenter, and he says, tell the queen at the time of Israel, who was not Christian, but worshipped a pagan religion that we now call it. And this angel said to Elijah, tell her that this religion is not true, that the only one true is Christianity. And that if you don't submit to Christianity, this country will have no rain and no crops, and everything will slowly die. So he tells her this, but she doesn't want to believe it, and she she commands every prophet in Israel to be killed. So basically, Elijah already feels guilty. He's hiding away. That's the beginning of the novel. Already feels guilty that almost all prophets of Israel have been killed because basically he said something like that. And the whole novel really is about him kind of doubting himself, mainly. Now, he does believe that there is God because he's heard the angel. Yet he doesn't necessarily believe God is benevolent, first of all, and he definitely doesn't believe that he is capable of being a prophet, even though he's being sent. So he has to leave the country. He's being fed by crows in the middle of nature, and then is being sent to the city of Akbar, which is outside of Israel, where their religion is the one of the queen. That's not Christianity. Yet he's supposed to go there. He's just supposed to go there and wait for further instruction to come back to Israel and save Israel from damnation. So I know it may sound very religious, and maybe even I might put you off if you're not very religious, but to be honest, the book is not at all, I would say, a religious book. It's not about Christianity per se. It's about the story of him not believing in himself and putting up with a lot of challenges. Basically, he does become accepted by the town of Akbar because they believe they shouldn't kill anyone. They have to take anyone in as guests. And the people do start to like him, but because of him, let's say, terrible things happen and a lot of people die accidentally. And he, again, thinks it's his own fault. And he keeps following the voices from his angels, and they seem sometimes a bit... they don't seem to make sense sometimes, in the sense they seem to be damaging other people. And the fifth mountain is basically the mountain that these people think where the gods live, but Elijah knows there are no gods. There's just one God.
Yeah.
And there's just always this kind of dilemma of what he believes, what the others believe, and he falls in love with the woman who takes him up and allows him to live in her house, and she's a widow. But he's also torn between, succumbing to the love of a woman and being a prophet. But the interesting thing is, God actually says in the book, that's why I don't think Paulo Coelho is necessarily liked by all Christians, because it's very kind of a different Christianity. God says, no man has lived properly until he has made love to his woman. And that's an interesting thing. There is a bit of a hippie element to the whole thing. Yet the person of Elijah, he's still kind of living this sort of more of a lot more repressed Christian personality that we think is Christianity. Yeah, Paulo Coelho always makes the point that the true God is actually not quite the church God. So I'm not sure what Paulo Coelho is, but he always feels like a Catholic who's also a hippie, and is also he's also meditated on Buddha. So it's a very interesting kind of spiritual mix. But I just find the story amazing. It is an adventure story in the end. I won't tell what happens more, but you don't have to look into the deeper meanings, which is about self-belief in the end, self-love, not about Christianity. But you can also just take that away, and in the end, it's just a great adventure novel, quite horrifying sometimes with all the death, but also with plenty of love and I find the description great of these deserts and the fifth mountain where he has to climb at one point. And I think it's a great novel. Really recommend it. It's Paulo Coelho. Check it out if you haven't already. The Alchemist, The Fifth Mountain.
Okay, sounds very good. Sounds something different than maybe we would normally read, but it sounds very good.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed it. I always like Coelho. His books often help me in times of change. And I was just reading this when I was just moving here to Ireland. So I've been in Ireland, guys, now since a few weeks. And just helped me. It was just a New Year's kind of book, and it just suited the vibe. Really recommend it, guys.
Cool. Well, before I get to my next book, I'll just mention, first of all, that if you want more, you can get it at patreon.com/booksboys. We are doing so much content. So you get this show early. You can get a Books Boys t-shirt. You can recommend books for us to read, depending on the level of your donation. But even at the most minimal level, you're getting all the bonus content. So this month, myself and Alex, we did a Playboys episode, and we did a full hour reviewing Shakespeare's A Winter's Tale. And that is on the A-level syllabus. We're working our way through the A-level ones. They're kind of semi-review, semi-study guide. So we did A Winter's Tale. Also with Robert, the third episode of Dark Place Dreamers, all about Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, is out. We did Skipper the Eye Child, and Robert thought it was absolute nonsense, and I thought it was brilliant. So it's more about getting his reaction to a crazy TV show with Matt Berry and Richard Ayoade and some of your favorites. And also another interview from the vault with the amazing singer-songwriter Kim Edwards that I did a decade ago, and I've re-released that on there as well. So you're basically getting a minimum of something every week actually on there. I mean, in December we put loads up, but usually you're getting a few extra shows per month on there for the price of a cup of coffee. So £2.50, $3. So I recommend checking that out.
And there's many more to come, including a special, which might include a bit more than just two people. So
yeah, we have something already in the works for this month. So hopefully people will enjoy that. Guys, the next book I read, look, you told me to try some Irish literature. And I remember on episode 4, Kieran specifically recommended Iris Murdoch. So I saw this one in the Magic Bookshop, where I went again this month, by the way. And I got Bruno's Dream. Now, I didn't love it, PJ. I didn't love it. I'm sorry. Again, similar to Middlemarch, it was all right. You know, I didn't dislike it, but I didn't really love it. And as we talked about this, you know, off air, it has a weird obsession with sexual themes. You know, for the characters' sake, for no real reason. You know, and that is something that struck me as unusual. But it also strikes me as unusual that all the characters have the same sexual obsessions. So I kind of put it down to poor writing, but all the male characters, bar one, are the same. And they have the same perversions, and they're all womanizers, and, you know, they all want to sleep with everyone and cheat on everyone and whatever else. And they all even use the same phrase. They never say, "Can I sleep with you?" or "Can we have sex?" It's always, "Can you come to bed with me?" Like, that's that exact phrase, but like 4 different guys are saying it. And I'm like, there's a little bit of lack of awareness there that 4 people are using like the exact same phrase, and they're all doing the same thing. And I just feel like it's a little bit, I don't know. I just feel like something's lacking from like good character development. I want to see the different characters behave differently, you know?
Yeah. Well, you know, Iris Murdoch, she did study, she taught and studied and wrote about philosophy, and Sartre being one of them, you know, and Sartre was the whole hell is other people philosophy. I feel like when I read her book, yes, the characters sometimes are very alike, but I think that's the point. I think the point is she's making a feminist jab at saying that you man are doing all the same thing the whole time. You're saying the same thing. Even if you sugarcoat it, would say, would you like to go to bed, give me, instead of would you like to F me? I think she's making a point that it's all very repetitive, I find.
What I do like about the women characters aren't any better, though. That's the thing.
Yeah, and that totally is. I agree with you. There's a lot of what's the word? It's a lot about sex, her books, like a lot. And also about, I suppose, also a lot about just kind of broken characters, aren't there? They're often very broken characters trying to connect, I suppose, and not really managing 100%. Also, yeah.
So the main character in this one's Bruno. He's kind of an old, dying man. He's almost entirely bedridden. They say at the moment he can still get up to use the toilet and things, but he's more or less bedridden. His skin's all sagging away. He's just faded away. They talk about this like shriveled, monstrous body with this big head, because I guess his head's still normal, and he's essentially just fading away to nothing. And he's living with Danby, and Danby's a kind of nephew, I guess. And although Danby seems to not really be good to anyone else in the novel, he is good to Bruno. Like, he takes Bruno in and he looks after him, and he's very happy to do so, And he gets a carer, Nigel, who's like a male nurse kind of chap who's into all this Zen type stuff. I'll get to Nigel in a minute. But they bring him in to look after Bruno, and that goes quite well. And Bruno has his stamp collection that's worth a lot of money. But it's never clear that Danby's trying to get the stamp collection, to be honest. He doesn't seem to have ulterior motives. He seems to just want to be nice to his relative, So you like Danby. And there's a girl living with him, Adelaide, who was hired as a kind of maid, as a housekeeper type character. And of course, Danby's sleeping with her, but they have this relationship, but he is also still paying her a wage, and it's a secret relationship, but she doesn't do any housekeeping, really. And there's this kind of, she feels that her position's not stable because she's essentially a paid mistress, and he could just fire her if he wanted to. She's not his girlfriend. She's not his wife, So she worries, which is fine, because actually she's already got backups, because she knows these two twins, Nigel, who is the carer, and his brother, Will. And she fancies Will. Well, actually, she's in love with both of them, as well as Danby, but she's mostly in love with Will. And she keeps stringing Will along. She's not sleeping with Will, but she's stringing him along, having a kind of emotional affair. He keeps thinking that there's a chance. But Will's horrible. Will's awful. He calls her names. He threatens to hit her. He tells her to steal one of the stamps so he can buy a camera. He tries to get her in trouble. He's just not a nice chap. And then we've got, Miles. Now, this chap, Miles, is Bruno's son. They've not seen each other for many, many years, but Bruno says that before I die, I would like to see my son. So Danby writes to Miles. And look, everybody, Miles, Danby, Bruno, they all talk about their past loves and how they mistreated all these previous women and how they got it wrong with these different women. And then now we have them all trying to repeat their own mistakes, because everyone wants to have an affair with everyone else's woman. So Adelaide's, going to cheat on Danby with Will. Danby seduces Miles' wife, Diana. Diana realizes...
Well, don't get too many spoilers, too.
We're not going to the end. We're not going to the end. This is the middle. Diana... This is important. Diana introduces her sister Lisa into the household, but then her husband Miles falls in love with Lisa. So we've just got like these overlapping Venn diagram love triangle things everywhere. And all the characters are more or less the same. And, at one point there's even a duel, like it's Dumas, But I'm not going to give anything about really the last quarter or about like what happens at the end. I didn't love it. I didn't love the ending. I didn't think that the book was particularly well written. There's just a lot of people who fall in love very, very quickly because a guy was a bit smarmy. So they, and everyone's we're very willing to cheat. There's not really any moral scruples in it. And then we have Nigel, and Nigel is just very strange. And they have these types of conversations. The world is independent of my will. The sense of it must lie outside of it. And in the world, everything is as it is, and happiness and happens as it does happen. In it, there is no value, and if there were, it would be of no value. And if good and bad willing changes the world, it can only change the limits of the world. Nigel just speaks like a weird philosophy textbook, and they wonder like what's happening with Nigel. He's doing a lot of drugs. What's his vibe, And then there's some weird stuff with the relationship between Nigel and Will as well. And there's just a lot of The characters react strangely to each other. It does get better as it goes along, to be honest, because we get some very ridiculous scenes where people's love drives them to do ridiculous things in an almost Flauberian kind of way. And it does pick up a little bit, and I wasn't sure if I loved the ending as such, but it's fine. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it because I find it's very sexual. A lot of the characters are a bit one-dimensional, but also very similar, So
okay.
It was fine, but I wouldn't read it again.
Okay. Well, I would recommend that you read The Sandcastle if you want to have one more go, or The Italian Girl. I find I haven't read this one you read, Bruno's Dream, but I find her books tend to be very, in some sense, my dad would say this, that they're not very memorable, but you're left with an impression, an atmosphere, and certain scenes. Like there's in Sandcastle, there's a scene where two kids kind of slit it's quite brutal actually. They slit the very bottom of their eye.
Oh, goodness.
So that they can cry blood. I mean, it's quite brutal, in fact. And then in Italian Girl, there's you just remember that there are two kind of lovers. One of them eats a lot of vegetables, one of them a lot of fruits, but they're supposed to be brothers. You're left with these impressions, and I find it's always very, it is always very overly sexual, but it's also very brutal, and it just shows how animal humans are. That's what I like about it personally.
Okay.
So I'm sure she'll be mentioned again at some point this year. So
could be. I read 3 more books, but I'm going to be honest. I'm really only going to do a review of one of them. I'm just going to quickly mention what the other 2 were. Okay, so the first one, because these 2 didn't make a great impression on me either, but the last one I loved. So I'm saving the best for last. I read by Apollonius Rhodius, or Apollonius of Rhodes, the Argonautica. So that's the story of Jason and the Argonauts. This was pretty quick. It was 200 pages. I'll be honest. After the length of time that Middlemarch took me, I was trying to read short books to fit some in. No more 500-600 pages. It was like, okay, I've got to read 200-page books here. So Bruno's Dream was only 300 pages and pretty short. This was 200. I mean, this is a nice translation. It's got the Greek and the English.
I love that. It's
lovely. Yeah, it's from the Macleay Library. Look, this has. It's written a little bit later than the kind of classical Greek period that I usually go in for. It's a story of Jason and the Argonauts. Medea's in there. Jason's trying to get the golden fleece, and he goes on his little quest. And in the end, with the goddess, it's actually easier than fighting her than to just kind of do some tasks and then convince her to marry him, so that it kind of ends nicely for him. But we've got other characters. Hercules is in there at one point near the beginning. Like the first half is honestly just them doing their oaths and their preparation and going to the oracle and kind of getting all ready, and then the second half some stuff actually happens. And look, you know what happens when you read this Greek stuff, it can be kind of boring in parts, but it's just that it's that basic story. He gets the fleece, it's all happy, but we have some similar themes from the Odyssey. Like they mention the Cyclops, they mention Scylla and Charybdis, the 2 kind of sea monsters, so a little bit of rehashing old themes as well in there, but yeah, look, it's fine if you're interested in that kind of thing. I think I've got 3 books in a row where I would say, if you think you'll like that kind of thing, maybe try it, but I wouldn't especially recommend them,
Okay.
And the same, I think, is going to be said for the next one. I didn't tell you I'd read this one, La Hojarasca by Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
All right. Okay. No, you haven't.
You know this one?
No, I haven't read that one. I think that's one of the earlier ones, what? Right?
Yeah. Look, it's early. I think the reason this book is remembered is because it has one character, a colonel or something, one character, and also the same town as one of the famous ones, I believe, 100 Years of Solitude.
Indeed, so. It's Macondo. So that's the town of 100 Years of Solitude.
Yeah.
The creation. Oh my God, I would love to read that.
This is a very short book. We're talking, it's less than 200 pages and with big text. I feel like this is about 120 pages. It's very short, I did like it, but at the same time, I didn't love it. And I find it difficult to get into. And I have a problem with these Latin American authors, which is that they never put enough dialogue in their books. And I really, really struggle to read a book that is just narrative without character work and dialogue. And it's the usual, it's set through multiple generations, so I get a bit confused going back and forward. The book opens with the doctor dying. Well, he's already dead, and that's kind of a powerful scene. But then, of course, that really takes place later. And I don't know. Look, I don't really have a lot to say about it because it is a very quick book, and I don't want to spoil anything because then you've spoiled the whole book. Really, like there's not a lot happens in it just because of its short length. But if you've liked 100 Years of Solitude, for example, then you might want to dip into something kind of set in the same world, if it were,
Wow. Okay. Well, I love 100 Years of Solitude, and I think you will love it too, despite the fact that it doesn't have much dialogue. Most Latin American novels, they do tend to describe generational storytelling. Generation storytelling mode, and 100 Years of Solitude probably has even less dialogue.
I struggle with that, and I feel it makes me feel bad because I'm trying to read in Spanish, and then I'm thinking I'm not enjoying this, and I always think my Spanish isn't on point. But no, when I read I can read 1,000 pages of fun, And even when I was reading H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds last month in English, that was 200 pages, and I struggled to get through it because of the lack of dialogue. So it's not a language thing. It is just I like characters and dialogue in my books, and I do struggle to get through a book that doesn't really have a lot of dialogue. And even when I'm reading it, I'm not taking in what's happening. This one's fine. We've got the different generations. There's some bad parts where the girl's forced to marry a guy that she's never met. Not that she doesn't love him, she's never met him, and just all the usual kind of stuff. But I didn't love it,
Well, okay. Well, I'd love to read that one. But guys, if you want to get some backdrop for 100 Years of Solitude, Leaf Storm or La Hojarasca.
Leaf Storm, yeah.
Is the book.
Honestly, I think that is the main reason anyone would read this book. It's going to be someone who already liked 100 Years of Solitude, and they want to kind of dip into a little bit extra in the same kind of universe.
I'd say so.
This book I loved. Now, we laughed about this during the month, PJ. Oh, yeah. I read... It's presented here now, you see it. The Son of Porthos by Alexandre Dumas. There
you go. The man himself, or
is it? Well, you open the book, and it has a biographical note on Dumas, and it gives me a lot of information about Alexandre Dumas, and a picture of Alexandre Dumas. Oh. And in the book, on at least 2 occasions, he mentions our previous work, The Man in the Iron Mask. So the author is saying, I'm Dumas, and this is what happened in the previous book I wrote. But this book was written 12 years after Dumas died. So this is not by Dumas.
Are you sure he just didn't live a long time? What about Alexandre Dumas Jr.? I mean, he was around too, wasn't he?
It could be, but this book is believed to not be canon, to not be by Dumas, to be just by a completely random guy. And I looked up to see what else this guy wrote, and he wrote a whole bunch of stuff, none of it I'd ever heard of, including one book. It was like The Countess of Monte Cristo or something like that. He wrote like a female version of the Count of Monte Cristo, so I thought that was very funny. But
I bet you're going to look out for more of his books.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
So what's the guy called?
Oh goodness, he's kind of a no-name. I didn't even bother to write down his name. It doesn't even say it in the book. Like when you read the book, it doesn't even say.
But you enjoyed the book, though.
So I loved the book. It's the best book I read this month. But let me get the name of the chap for you. Believed to have been written by Paul Mahallen.
Well, tell George Eliot to move aside because we got a new kid in town, right?
Everyone's favorite, well-known author, Paul Mahallen. So, look, this book does not have the Three Musketeers, right? Or D'Artagnan. D'Artagnan's not in it. I'm not going to tell people why. I don't want to spoil things from any of the other books, but D'Artagnan's not in it. Athos isn't in it. And Porthos isn't in it. The only one who's in it is Aramis. And Aramis is a very old man. And Aramis has kind of changed in character a little bit. I mean, he was always the sneakiest of the Musketeers, but now he's basically the bad guy. Okay? So he's plotting. He wants it, he's already like high high priest of the Jesuits. He wants to become pope. He's got a lot of political power. He's moved from France to Spain. He wants to do some maneuvering to get control of the French throne now. And he's also going to use Porthos' son as part of that whole thing. But of course, he doesn't know it's Porthos' son. Okay, so the son of Porthos is this random guy called Joel. And Joel never knew who his dad was, but Joel's a big old guy because Porthos was the big, strong, giant musketeer. And he finds this sword in the spot where Porthos died. Somehow, this like image of his dad gives him the sword, you know, and it's a massive sword. And on the sword, it says, all for one and one for all, engraved on the sword. Which is, of course, the slogan of the Musketeers, which is actually only ever said once in the whole series of 5 books.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's in the very first book. It's the only time they ever say it. Until now, it's on the sword. So that's cool, right? And, you know, he meets but I love the romance, man. I love the romance. He meets this lovely girl, Aurora. And he's valiant. So he sees some guys heckling this girl, and he jumps in, and he's going to save the day. And he's got his brandishing his sword, and he chases away the bad guys. And they're stealing money from people, and he comes in and saves the day. He's very valiant. And this is one of these books where everyone's challenging people to duels, left, right, and center. And if you say something bad in the presence of a woman, then I'm going to lay down my gauntlet and we're going to have a duel and we're all going to die. And I love it. I love the romance of these books.
I like that. Yeah,
and it's very short as well. It's like 200 pages. I think it's very, very short, but maybe 300 at a push. But it's the best book I read this month. Like I loved it. Aramis's scheming took me a little bit by surprise because I think that he's not quite there in the Three Musketeers. But then again, a lot of years are supposed to have passed. So maybe he's gotten worse, he's taken his worst trait and he's gotten worse and worse, as time has gone on. And I guess that's something that could happen. But I love the swashbuckling. I do like that we get to see Porthos' son. And I don't want to really give spoilers for the ending, but throughout most of the book, Aramis and Joel don't know who each other is.
And because we did talk about Alice Automated by Jeff Noon, where he basically pretends to write. He writes a sequel to the two original Alice books, and he did imitate the star very well in the first half, up to the point that it became less of an Alice story. Did this author also imitate the Dumas senior style very well? Or
Yes.
Did you feel that? Yeah.
Yes, excellently. You would think this was Dumas. Like, it's believably by Dumas. Yeah, it's very, very well done.
That's impressive.
My only criticism is that it rushes a lot near the end. Like, Dumas' books would typically be longer than this. And this book starts out quite slow in the usual way. Slow but exciting. Dumas is a master of that. But then just kind of near the end, it just like all rushes. And it's like, okay, everything's got to wrap up in the next 50 pages. Like, I don't know why it kind of gets so quick, But... look, it's lovely. You don't get to see too many of the characters but I mean, look at the kind of romantic scenes where Joel, this girl he's only met like 2 days ago, and he's saying, that he would lay down his life for her and shed all the blood in his body to protect her, and she's in love with him. And there's a nice scene where there's going to be a wedding, so they put Joel in jail, and it becomes very reminiscent of the Count of Monte Cristo at that point. And he doesn't know that he's getting let out, so they take him to a wedding. Because they want to use him as a pawn in their political game, but he thinks he's been taken to his execution. So there's nice comic scenes where he's saying, like, I know the last meal's supposed to be kind of fancy, but like I'm in a palace, like where have they taken me? And they're always talking at cross purposes where he's like, oh, the big day's here, and they mean the wedding, and he means that he's being killed.
Oh, right, okay.
I'm losing my freedom, and they're like, yeah.
Sounds very Woodhouseian again.
There's a bit of that, yeah. And they're kind of speaking, because this old-fashioned sexist idea that when you get married, you kind of lose your freedom and so they're saying that kind of stuff, but he thinks it's about him dying, so that's quite funny. Yeah. That's quite funny.
Wow, I'd love to read it. Right, and what's the book called again?
The Son of Porthos. My favorite bit from the whole book, someone says, and what might your name be? And he says, I'm not sure what it might be, but it is Joel. I love that. I don't know why. I love that so much, but it is hilarious.
Is that a phrase you're going to start using? I think so, right?
I think so. There's a lovely little chap called Friquet, who's a kind of guess they describe him as like a kind of dwarf, essentially. Like he's a very short person, but he's high up. He's in the military and things. Like he's an important person, but he's very, very hot-headed because people are always making fun of his height. And when they meet in the tavern, and he wants some food, and Porthos wants to share his food, and they have a duel, and they're going to fight, and the landlord's in on the duel, and the barman's in on the duel, and they're all going to have a big fight. And then they all become best friends, and now they're friends for life, and they love each other platonically, and they help each other out in the army later on. Like I just love the bonds that these people form over a duel or over a meeting in one day. You know, that romance. It's amazing, and this is written very, very excellently, exactly like the Dumas, the whole series of Dumas books. So it's if you've read the Three Musketeers series, and you just thought it would be lovely if there was a little bit more, then this is essentially a very early example of fan fiction, that is just perfect.
I think it would be interesting also to now check out Alexandre Dumas Jr.'s book, because I mean, I'm just wondering if there's anything.
I don't know a lot about Junior, to be perfectly honest.
But he is an author, and he was an author, and I do see his books from time to time, especially in secondhand bookshops in the French section. So at least in the original French, it's relatively popular. So I think.
Okay, I've never tried it, to be honest, but I love to. I mean, this is risky business, but I would maybe put Dumas almost on. Like if Dickens is 100%, Dumas like 99. Like it's really. I think that Dumas is a very, very special author. So the only reason I can't quite tie him with Dickens is because I've read all of Dickens and I've really only read a certain amount of Dumas, so it wouldn't be fair. Like he could have a couple of terrible books in there for all I know, and that's the problem,
Well, we'll see then when you've read them. I'm sure you will.
Well, I will. I've got one on my shelf to go to, but
let me tell you what I read. I also read after The Fifth Mountain. I read the first two plays of the Dublin Trilogy by Sean O'Casey. So Sean O'Casey being a big man for Ireland becoming Ireland. So written, so he's basically a self-taught, but kind of a politician kind of figure. But he just started writing plays. He wasn't really educated, but he started writing plays around the Easter Rising time of Ireland, when Ireland started to want to become independent and want to not be a British satellite state, basically. Or under British rule. And he writes the Dublin Trilogy, which is very much celebrated at least in the Republic of Ireland, and it consists of 3 plays. And so I've read the first 2. The first one is The Shadow of a Gunman, followed by Juno and the Paycock, and the third one is The Plug and the Stars. And the last 2 particularly are often at the Abbey Theatre played in Irish theatres. Now, The Shadow of a Gunman is a great story, slightly, I would say, easier to produce than the other 2. It's basically set around the Civil War period, but they're not soldiers. It's just a poet living with another man. Basically, he doesn't really do anything particular, tries to just earn money. And there's a lot of the Irish War is kind of behind the scenes, so it's all set in one of the man's room, Mr. Shields' room, and you hear a lot behind what's going on. And Mr. Shields has a friend called Mr. Mulligan, who's in the let's just say he's kind of involved with things going on outside. I can't spoil anything. It does use Chekhov's gun methods. In this Chekhov's gun method, in the sense of there is a prop element. Chekhov's gun is when you got a gun on the stage, it's got to be shot at some point. And there's a lot. Hitchcock plays a lot with that notion, right? So there's object there, and there's something's going to be. It's going to be meaningful. It has to be used for something. It's used in Psycho, for example, was a suitcase of money at the beginning.
Yes,
but Chekhov started this, and Sean O'Casey. Don't get me wrong. He's a very well-read, I think an intellectual, but very much self-made intellectual, very typical of Ireland at the time. And so very much there is a suitcase in the play. So Mr. Mulligan leaves a suitcase behind. He just comes in to visit, says he can't come. He was going to do something with Mr. Shields, something related to work, and he just has to go. And then it turns out that he's killed, and it's on the newspaper. And everyone just forgets about that suitcase in the room. And that's very relevant because people start to believe that the poets living with Mr. Shields is involved with the IRA, so the Irish Republican Army.
Right.
And he kind of plays along with it because a certain attractive woman called Minnie Powell seems to find it very romantic and exciting that he might be in the IRA, and he doesn't admit it ever, but he's kind of playing along, just flirting away, which and people from the building asking for favors, and he's just kind of playing along with it to humor Minnie, which I'm afraid leads to some dire consequences when the black tans, basically let's say black tans, for those who don't know, is the name given to the basically British police, just making sure that British police making sure that everything's in order in Ireland, and they're considered very vicious because they also did kill a lot of innocent Irish people. So it's mentioned in a lot of Irish folk songs. Not a nice thing to call them, but I suppose black and tans because they wore black and khaki colored clothes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it is very much about that. It becomes very violent. The second act, of course, when these two guys and the whole building actually becomes, let's say, attacked by black and tan, looking for RA soldiers, and yes, tragedy strikes in very dire consequences. And the whole Dublin trilogy is really tragic. It's just Dublin during the Civil War and just after, and it's quite cynical actually. So it's really cynical. The characters are described. I think James Joyce, I don't feel like James Joyce really had that much love of Irish culture. He made a lot of fun of it. I think Sean O'Casey did have, let's say, too much love. So he's not making fun of these people that often seem very, very vulgar. But I think he's just making a point that, well, it's very sad that these lovely people turn out this vulgar because of poverty, because of repression. And this theme continues on with the next play, Juno and the Paycock. Paycock being the Irish pronunciation of peacock. Juno is a woman who has to deal with her husband, who's a peacock. He keeps kind of showing off around town. He's a drunk, really. Pretends to be a soldier, pretends to be a bit of an Ishmael kind of figure, a bit of a captain. And I think he just drove with a boat from Dublin to Wales or something ridiculous. And he's a ridiculous character, Captain Jack Bull, the husband of Juno. And he always walks around with Joxer, who's a man he's kind of like, he just takes advantage of Captain Jack Bull. He just drinks with him, makes sure he gets paid for everything. It's kind of like a leech, parasite-esque character. And it's basically about Juno and her family, and that everyone is suffering because not so clearly the war in this time. It's set during the Irish Civil War, but I don't feel it's as action filled as the previous play. This is more just simply about the society, and that she's got a drunk husband, a son who was almost killed and who became maimed, and he's now living there, and he's actually like traumatized, and he finds loud noises deeply disturbing, and she's got a daughter who's quite well read and wants to really move further in life, but she gets manipulated by a seemingly nice gentleman. And the irony is the seemingly nice gentleman is actually maybe in some sense the most careless character of all, even though he talks about like being a yogi and being I think he's a pantheist or he has some kind of different notions. And the point is, though, at the end of the first act, the family thinks they're going to earn a lot of money because a cousin is giving his cousins all his money. Because he died. So he's got the cousin is giving the cousins the money, and Captain Jack Bull is delighted. He doesn't wait for the money to come. He just buys as much stuff as possible and says he will give the money back to everyone. Tragedy is, little spoiler, guys, although it might seem obvious as well, the money never comes because literally the cousin did give his money to his cousins, but that meant cousins all over the world, first, second, third removed. So it's a bit of a comedic element. There is more comedy in Juno and the Paycock, although it's also more brutal. Again, the ending, what happens. I can't say much more, except it's again revolves around RA and yes, but also about alcoholism. I find not just about the Irish Civil War right now. It's also about just the Irish people having a big starting to have bad habits, drinking too much, being too military, ever having guns, and all the young men dying. Maybe the woman being too naive and being too attracted to like, oh, this lovely gentleman who studies in England. So it is more of a social critical play, whereas the other one is very much it's a bit more action filled, I find. Now I love to talk about the next one, but I hadn't finished it yet. So that will be for the next episode, the third part, Glow in the Stars, which so far is even more vicious and a bit hard to read, I find. So right. I'll see if I'm not sure if I'm enjoying it that much, but I do love The Shadow of a Gunman and Juno and Paycock. They were absolutely wow. Okay. Amazing.
It's not something I would have ever thought to read, so that's an interesting recommendation.
Really powerful, though. Really powerful.
Sounds it.
Yeah, Sean O'Casey. And
you read one more book, am I right, PJ?
I did. I read The Essence of an Hour by Susan Ferber. Susan Ferber is an American author who moved to England when she was 19, I believe. And she's just as old as Dustin. She was born in 1992. And I found that very interesting because she writes the story is set in 1941. And it describes let's say, the last summer of American innocence, as is written in the back, of the 18-year-old Lily Corrigan, who's a second generational Irish American young woman, well, girl essentially, and who just grows up on this island close to New York, and but really it's a very secluded little area, and she's going to a Catholic school, and it begins with her going to a party actually. And in the party, she's not a likable character, I have to find. I didn't find it necessarily easy actually to read at first, to be honest. It took me a while, and then I really got into it. But let me describe first. So at the beginning, it's a bit like, I'm just wondering what's this all about. She seems very cynical. There's just a lot of drinking involved, and they talk a bit about sex, but it's just, yeah, but, is there going to be a story? But then you start realizing that behind that facade, it's just a really fragile girl who's lost her mother and who's actually really struggling with becoming friends, because she has a friend, but she has one childhood friend, but she feels herself becoming more and more distant to her as she slowly grows into a very well-read woman with opinions and dreams about going outside the island, and actually being quite frightened about marrying and having babies, and questioning a lot of things now. And she's basically very typical for the Irish. She's even though she kind of wants to consider an atheist, she still secretly does believe in hell and the Virgin Mary especially. And I find that very interesting, just from my dad's family. Yeah. From my dad's family, I thought it was a very good. It just evoked a lot of James Joyce and Ed O'Brien or Ernest Murdoch. Yes, I thought that was very interesting. So she mainly has the books. She's a big reader, and she loves especially basically what we now consider American classics, but what for her time were just American contemporary novels, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and she also reads a bit of Virginia Woolf. And it's interesting because they're not at all classics. We forget that they're just considered trash actually by parents and by the people on the island. But this is her basically escape from reality, I should say, or her education into further reality. And she can only share this with one boy who she grew up with called Teddy. and she kind of looks up to Teddy, as is in love with Teddy, but she doesn't really want to admit it because they're such friends. And she's trying to discover her sexuality. She's trying to discover men. She's trying to be very elegant. She's trying to live this kind of jazz life that has long expired. It's not the 20s, it's 1941, and there's a war going on around the world. It's March 1941, so America is not in the war yet, but you do get that tension, and you knowing that America will be in the war in December because of Pearl Harbor also is very relevant. So it's basically about her and Teddy becoming eventually a couple, and all the things that go wrong in between and go wrong afterwards. Basically, Teddy also has lost a brother, and where she's lost a mother, and both of them are dealing with death in a sense of they're trying to live this life that they've read and want to live, and they want to get away from this. I want to get away from this repressive culture, from the Catholic parents. And in her case, only a very strict Catholic aunt, actually, and her dad doesn't really care. But her dad doesn't talk to her either, so she feels very lonely. And the book is about her talking about it, 1941 in the past. It's set around 10 years later, very vague, and it always gives you very vague hints what happens to her 10 years later, but you're not clear ever, even in the end, what exactly happened to her.
Okay.
But it just mirrors this type of story about her maybe losing her mind a bit, entering a state of depression as she realizes not only is she losing her childhood's best friend, but she's Lara, but she's also losing Teddy, who she thinks is the love of her life. And yes, there is beautiful scenes in it of love, and then not falling out of love, but just basically not being strong enough to stay together. They go to different places to study. And the second half of the novel is very much about that. Just kind of her dealing with this loss of religion, loss of friendship, loss of identity. And it's a very beautiful book. I think it's great. As I said, for me, it was difficult to engage with the character at the beginning, but then you soon realize that there's more to it if you just peel beneath. And I find particularly her thoughts about sex were very interesting, because I think it also mirrors even nowadays, there's still confusion around sex, even though there's so much supposedly so much information. So it is very much about sex, or the confusion of sex, and then ultimately maybe the disappointments and irrelevance of sex, according to her. So it's a great book. Read recommended. It's a beautiful read. It's very multi-layered. Was great character development, and some of the characters you think are very maybe superficial end up being very deep, or the other way around. You do meet a lot of hipster type fellows eventually when she moves to university, and they just end up being very hollow. And also just children. It's all about children wanting to be adults, and the war's just around the corner, and they do become adults, but at the same time they're just broken children. So it
sounds very good, PJ.
Beautiful. It's beautiful. The essence of an hour.
Hold on.
Oh, what's this?
Okay, I think I hear the phone ringing.
Oh, so let's pick it up.
Let's pick up and see who we've got on the line. Hey, you're through the Books Boys. You've got Dean and PJ on the line. Who's calling?
Who's this?
Hi, this is Susan Ferber.
What? That's a crazy coincidence. We were just talking about your book.
PJ was just telling me all about it, so that's great timing.
Oh my God. Well, Suzanne, welcome to the show. I've got a lot of things to ask you about the book. First of all, I love the book. It's really, and it's your first book, right?
Yes, yeah. It was my first published book. I've been writing.
Oh, right, okay.
Well, I've been writing like stories since I was a kid.
Okay.
So when I die, my estate can have that.
And is this the first novel you wrote, or is there also maybe some unpublished stuff?
That should stay unpublished. Yes.
Okay, stay unpublished. Okay.
Yes, but yes, I actually wrote the first draft of this when I was 19.
Okay. Didn't know that.
So yeah, and then it was published just last February.
Yes.
When I just turned 29. So it was kind of like 10 years in the making in a way.
I was trying to figure out the gap, but also thinking never ask a lady her age. So like some time has passed. I do not know how much.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I know you were born in 1992. It says at the back, and I thought it was very interesting because we're all 92.
We're all 1992, yeah.
Which is the cool class. This is the best year, right? And I thought it was very interesting as well because I also wrote a novel, but I haven't published it yet. I just thought it interesting to see a really contemporary author to all of us on all of the same year. And I've got a question about that, first of all. So I was mentioning that the book is set in 1941 to onwards to the late 40s, but mainly it's set in 1941 and it's upcoming to the Pearl Harbor events in the US. And I was just wondering, first of all, so being born 1992, what exactly attracted you to write it in specifically 1941, which isn't, and just before the war, it's kind of at least for Europeans, I feel it's a very gray sort of area. It's like what's a lot is happening in Europe, but what is USA doing, at that time, because it wasn't involved in the war yet. So it starts up in March 1941, right?
Yes, it starts in March 1941 and sort of concludes the main action of the novel in April of 1942. Yeah. And then we do have her reflecting about 10 years later. So, late 40s, early 1950s. Yeah. And I suppose why I was drawn to that era is because I've always loved historical fiction or fiction written in a different time period. So it would have been contemporary fiction to them, but historical to us. Okay. And my grandmother, who is probably, she was a few years younger than the main character, Lily Kerrigan, when she was growing up at that time in the early 40s, but she would tell us lots of stories about that. And so, I would always glean different facts from her childhood and wonder what her world had looked like. And, she and my grandfather would tell us about that ingraining of that memory of Pearl Harbor being announced and how they had just come home from, mass and how they'd heard that on the radio. And I think those stories infected my childhood and sparked my imagination. So I was always drawn to that time. I also think it is an interesting time historically for women in that it is a time where women were, a certain class of women, were starting to go to university, were allowed to pursue degrees, but were not really allowed to do anything with it afterwards, or not anything seriously. They might work for a little bit in marketing or in journalism, but there would come an expiration where they were, expected to get married. And I wondered what it would look like for a woman who was of Sylvia Plath's generation or a Betty Friedan's generation, or even someone like Betty Draper on Mad Men. How did those women become those women in the 1950s? Right. What did their education look like? And what did their childhood look like? What did their sex lives look like? Or, lack of education about sex look like?
Well, that's very interesting. I think it's very interesting because she's obviously Lily Corrigan. She grew up in this Catholic environment, in this kind of conservative, very much repressed Catholic environment, and reminds me a lot of what my dad tells me about his childhood in Ireland, especially around Eamon de Valera kind of era. Actually, he's not that old, bless him, but I mean, his parents, and just a kind of that environment of, the church had a lot of power, and there's a lot of repression. And even I feel the effects of Irish repression, honestly, I do, and that guilt. And I find that's very interesting that she's always guilty, especially when it's related about sex. And also, I suppose she's got an obsession with death. She can't get over her mother's death. And I find that's very Irish. So they did a great job there. It feels like a very Irish character.
Yes, and I think she is second generation Irish in the novels. Yes. She has she's Catholic upbringing, and that is in some ways my own upbringing, in that I was brought up in a very conservative Catholic household. I went to a very conservative Catholic university, and lots of the conversations they have in that book are not that divorced from the conversations we were having in about 2010, which is
my
alarming. And again, I think that's why I was drawn to the past as well as thinking, right, I don't think people are going to understand that, people are still speaking this way. But if I said it in the past and then, think, oh, are we still speaking this way and reflecting it, it might make more of an impact in a certain sense. But certainly the other thing that really came into play was when I was writing the book, the first draft, I had just finished reading The Country Girls by Edna O'Brien. And I remember reading that and thinking, my God, that's the book I want to write. I wish I could write that sort of book, that where she, mirrors those two friends growing up in such close parallel together, and how their stories of coming of age impact one another, and how much authority the church has in their lives at every moment. And again, reading, as I said, lots of Victorian literature growing up, I was operating in a very Protestant literature world. So I didn't know until I read Edna O'Brien or James Joyce that one could actually write about Catholicism and make it interesting, and that loss of faith could be as devastating as, the loss of a lover. So that was, really what I wanted to express in this book as well, is, that I had found that in other books. And I think, again, having that sort of empowered me to then, question my own religion and my own relationship with it. So I think literature is so important in that way to tell those stories.
Wow. Funny that you mentioned Edna O'Brien, because she's one of these Irish authors that really talked about sex very openly. I think she started writing about the 60s. I'm not sure. Yes. But I did read one or two books and thinking age 16, oh, wow, I didn't know this. And, we are 1992 kids, but I didn't know about the stuff she was talking about, or, it was still very enlightening, even though she grew up in a time where none of this information age didn't exist. So, and James Joyce, and we're just talking, me and Dean, about Iris Murdoch. There are these Irish authors, or in Iris Murdoch's case, partially Irish. But just even if you're just partially Irish, you have this, you do follow this tradition of being obsessed with sex because it's so repressed simply. And then it's really nothing that special, as kind of Lily Carrigan, she talks about in the end of the book, she kind of says, without spoiling it, she just kind of points that it's not that important, sex, but you kind of make a big deal of it. And she does make a great deal of it. And the book is very much about her trying to find some answers about sex and being very confused. And it's in that sense, I find it's a very Irish book, I feel like. So it's great.
Thank you for that. And that's really nice to hear, because as I said, I was so indebted to Irish literature and writing it, and to taking, as I said, sort of Edna O'Brien's story of, going to Dublin in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, and thinking about how that would have looked in America. And again, I love this bit in The Country Girls. There's a really exciting bit where they get on the train to go to Dublin, and that's the most exciting thing they've ever done in their lives. And I'm from a very small town, and I remember that excitement. And I wasn't even going to New York City. I was going to Buffalo, which is not a big city. But it was the city, closest to where I was from. And I remember that excitement of, getting out of the tininess of my little town, and seeing that reflected in literature and thinking, right, that's me. And it's a very different context. And it's a very different story from my story. And, I'm not trying to, sort of appropriate my story or her story or write myself into that, but that's a reflection of going, oh, I know that feeling. I'm so glad somebody else has expressed that feeling.
Yes, and it's interesting that it's timeless, right? So great literature is really timeless, and you can relate to, Medea, and you can relate to Shakespeare, and you can relate to Edna O'Brien or Ulysses, and it's all amazing. And this love of literature that obviously you have is very much in Lily and Teddy. So Teddy is basically it's described in the book that she is basically Lily, or in man's form, or as Jack says it, he says the other way around, that he understands Lily because Lily's just like Teddy. But so you've got these two teens who are in love with literature, and they're outsiders, and they kind of think of themselves a bit, too good for the rest of them, because they've got all this literature there, and I suppose they're trying to be cynical, but they're not even, because they're that innocent, really.
Yes.
And I find it interesting because in the book at the beginning, they do seem very much like adults, especially Teddy, because I feel like he's getting this. She's making him very mythical. Yes. So, and I find it interesting what happens at the end. I'm not going to spoil, but I find if you reread the book, it makes very much sense why he's being portrayed in such a mythical figure in this kind of using memories. So I like that. But then it becomes clear the more you read that he's just a teenager, and that he's just a teenager, and they're just kids, not even teenagers, and they don't actually know. Yes, and without spoilers, they don't really become that, let's say, sexually educated. Some other naive people in the book that seem naive make love, let's just say. But she remains a very not naive, but she remains a virgin throughout the whole story. Really, it was interesting because she's trying to actually get away from that innocent virgin look. She's trying to become a modern woman, and she doesn't know where she is. She's still got that Catholic belief. I love all that. And I just wanted to ask you, so this book, what was the intention of writing this book? Because it feels like a very educative novel for certain people. But I'm just wondering, did you think of a core audience when you were writing this book, or of a certain type of person that you want to read this book?
So I think with all the references to literature, I think there are two ways to read it. And I suppose what I would love for it to serve as is an introduction to, these are lots of great books. I remember reading when I was 12, again, one of the sort of gateways for me into literature was reading Anne of Green Gables. And I remember there were so many references to Victorian literature, to Tennyson, to Keats, and to Shakespeare. And I thought, I want to understand all those references. I want to read all those books. And that really then, kind of kickstarted me going, off and finding that. And so I think the book can be read in two ways. I think it can be read by people who have read, the books and get some of the jokes or get some of the references. And sometimes they're very discreet references, and sometimes they're really quite in your face references, or it just names the book that she's referencing or the writer. But you could get those, but equally you could say, right, I haven't read that person, or that sounds interesting, I would like to go and read that, or that sort of inspiration of who are Lily's authors, what is forming her worldview. And I was also thinking, while writing it, that everything she has to read has to be accessible to her, so she has to get all of those books. So even something like, she does reference Lady Chatterley's Lover, but it can't quite be the right version because that wouldn't have been available to her. So how does she get her hands on these? And people like Fitzgerald and Hemingway, of course, they're modernist literature, we consider them classics now, but they were popular novels. She would have access to them. People would treat them as sort of sexy books, but they weren't. She's not reading Henry Miller, for instance, in it. Because she can't get a copy of Ulysses, which is a pity, but it's just not 1941 time yet. So I was thinking about that too, and again, so I would love, as I said, I would love for people to read it and to think as a gateway to sort of more serious sort of classic literature, actually. And obviously there are echoes of other novels in there too, like The Bell Jar or And No Brown Country Girls, or lots of other books that I love from that period, like Mary McCarthy's The Group, which is just fabulous. Again, she wrote that I think in the 60s, but it's about her time at university in the 1930s and what all the women did after they left university. So again, there's a real love of other books that I think Lily would have been reading at that time. In a way, this sounds quite pretentious, I suppose, but in a way, like something like Atonement, where the character Bryony is so, sort of entrenched in literature and all the other books that are happening around her at that time. And one of the things Ian McEwan does so brilliantly is to write the Book of Atonement as Bryony, having grown up in that time, would have written the book. So I was thinking about things like that too.
Wow, that's great. And I do love the fact that it makes a lot of reference to books. And yes, you're left with a list of books you've either haven't read yet and would like to read, or maybe you'd like to rediscover. I mean, I'd say like you, literature really helped me in my life. So I read a lot of those books, but it still makes me want to go back, I would say, to some of them, because it was interesting, because I thought it was a list of books that a very bookish person would read, but up to a certain age. So I actually read those books up to maybe around 20, I think, which is just saying that I think there's a reason why she's interested in Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Virginia Woolf at that time. And she mentioned Mrs. Dalloway. I mean, I read that when I was 18, I think, as well. And yeah, it's great, because it really it talks to that youth that is very bookish and that's still a minority. Nothing has changed really. So it talks to them, say, well, get these books if you like. So it's a great homage to that literature.
So what you're saying, PJ, is this book has got so many book recommendations, people won't even need to listen to the podcast anymore.
I'm afraid so. They can just get the book and get all the references.
That's it.
And I find interesting that she becomes, one thing I find interesting is that she does become more interested in world literature when she enters the outside world of her little island, because she starts to read Middlemarch and Madame Bovary. And I just, I'm not sure if that was that intentional, that her literature, even though she did read a lot of the now considered classics, it was quite American when she was living in the island. And then it became, and now a lot of Furber and George Eliot.
Oh, I like that. I actually didn't think about that. I was thinking,
all right, okay.
I was thinking more sort of practically.
Okay.
That those would be the more books that she would have read at university at that time, versus the other ones would have been considered more popular literature, not really worthy of great study yet.
Right, okay.
So that's what I was thinking more. But obviously, most of those books do, Madame Bovary, for instance, is about a woman who can never escape the town that she's from.
Yes.
She constantly wants to get to Paris and she never can. So that's part of it. And then Anna Karenina is mentioned several times, with the train journeys and the inability to break past your constrictive society as well.
Yes, and she mentions which one she likes particularly, which ones she doesn't like. So she does mention that she reads Madame Bovary, she really loves it. I also want to ask you something else. There are several descriptions of parties in the book, and let's be honest, they are not very flattering depictions of parties. And they just remind me more, when she goes into a party, this is a kind of party I would expect from the year 2010 onwards. What exactly was your intention with writing, first of all, so many party scenes that were very disappointing, unflattering, and pretty horrendous in like one or two situations?
Yes. And again, I think that was a huge part for me of the novel, that opening scene where she is, to sort of give a trigger warning around it. She is, she is assaulted by a young man at a party, and it sets her up on this journey of remembering of what happened that year. She is in a state of trauma from that, and from other events, obviously, previous to that, with the death of her mother. And she's trying to connect those traumatic pieces together. But she sees that as a real sort of start point of her falling apart, I think, mentally.
Okay.
And so that's interesting to me. It was part of my own experience of having been at a very Catholic university, that we would go out on Saturday night and we would have these weird parties, and then the next day everybody would be at mass hugging each other, and I would think, that's not okay. You were awful to me yesterday, you were predatory, and now you think you can hug me at the sign of peace? That I just didn't understand this mind frame of young men in that atmosphere. And so I tried to imagine how that would have been at the time in the 1940s, a time where, I think what happens to her, even now, I think some people would say, oh, it's not that bad. It's not, it's not the worst thing that could happen. And certainly in that time period, I think people would have been very dismissive of what happens to her. And I was trying to understand how that would have worked That sort of parallel between now and then. But some of the other parties as well were, again, I think making fun of a bit. If we're all 1992, we remember the height of the hipster culture. And of course, the 1940s had the similar culture of Bohemia and the beginning of the Beats. And I read novels where they do make fun of that sort of scene, where that scene is sort of happening, of this pretension of people reading too much novels, but not really understanding what the novel's about. It's like when people read The Great Gatsby and are like, oh, I want to go to a Gatsby party, and you're like, do you really?
Yeah, exactly.
Awful.
Yeah. Totally.
So I was trying to capture that as well. So I think part of it is, again, that sort of, how do we find ourselves and locate ourselves in a book from the past, and what scary revelations can we find about our own society within a book set in the past, and say, we've moved on so far, or women have moved on so far, and yet women have not moved on, and our society has not moved on in some ways.
I think perhaps a very slight spoiler here, but I think one very shocking aspect is that at the beginning it's right at the beginning. She has a sexual encounter that she's not enjoying at all, and the drunk man says that he will rape her. But this slight spoiler, I find it very interesting that she makes it sound very, what's the word? She tries to make it sound less worse than it is at the beginning. And only as you read the novel, when she comes back to it, because there was an ellipsis, I thought it was just a drunk guy falling asleep. But then it's just, you realize as you read the novel, when she goes back, she just didn't mention it. So she's an unreliable narrator, and I like that. And it just, and it doesn't matter if you mention it or not. It also questions the reader. Well, it doesn't matter if you didn't mention it, you should, it's still not correct. So there's this whole kind of politics of basically this machismo culture, and it's still relevant, and it was then. And this confusion I find was what is okay, what's not okay. It's not okay, but even women sometimes, I feel, try to belittle it, I feel.
Yes, you sort of pass it off, because I think sometimes when, I think we live in a better world now to some extent than we did even 10 years ago on lots of these issues, where, people talk about them more openly. And it is of course, we have the Me Too movement where, that's quite public, but, even as just speaking with friends and you saying, oh yes, I've had that experience as well. Yeah. And you feeling validated by thinking, oh, okay, it wasn't just me. And this is a character who continually is trying to tell people about what happened to her, and nobody really seems to want to listen. They either say, oh, well, no, that's fine, whatever, or they're so far removed, they're actually more naive than she is, so they can't really understand it either. And even the girlfriends who are being dismissive, you do have to wonder, are they being dismissive because they don't want to re-invite their own memories of what's happened to them? I mean, what has happened to them that they have that attitude? So I do think that was, it's very much a part of my experience. I think it's, troublingly too much, part of many people's experiences.
Yes.
But somebody like Lily, what she needs is somebody to say, look, yeah, no, I understand, but nobody ever does that to her. So she's completely insular about it and can't formulate where she puts it in her narrative. And I think that is why she keeps revisiting it and keeps remembering it in different ways, and keeps, sort of eking out different details about it, because she is uncomfortable with the fact that this has happened to her. She is uncomfortable that somebody has come in and taken her narrative from her, has taken her free will from her. And she, there's other things that happen in the book as well, where it feels like, for me, Lily as a character is somebody who sees herself as a heroine, who sees herself as a woman of action. But ultimately, she really does nothing in the novel. Everything kind of happens to her, and she doesn't like that.
That's interesting. Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that. So yeah, it's she, because she doesn't really. She has a lot of dreams, but she doesn't really fulfill them in the dream. She kind of just lets things happen, and she drowns herself in alcohol, self-pity, and kind of morbid thoughts about death. But I find it interesting because I have to say I didn't find her very likable at the beginning. Yes. It took me a while, but I think it's a good character because she seems very cynical, as I said, very mean actually at the beginning. But then if you just peel the layers one after the other, you just find it's just a little girl who's afraid. And all she really wants from Teddy is a hug. And all she wants from best friend Laura is to be understood. And she doesn't really get any of that properly. She doesn't get understood. She doesn't get the connection she wants with Teddy, really. I have one last question.
Okay.
Teddy, being also fond of literature, I feel like he tries to imitate that Hemingway figure. He tries to imitate a bit of Fitzgerald. Yes. What was your inspiration of Teddy? What kind of, if I may ask, was it? Is it someone? Is he supposed to be a collage of male figures you've read about, or do you feel like there are many Teddys out there who want to be this heroic figure and are just teens inside?
I think it's kind of both in a way. I think he is an homage to, his name, for instance, is supposed to be Little Women, the character of Laurie, and he's quite like Laurie. And, obviously Lily sees herself as Jo, and Laurie's other name is Teddy. So that's how he gets his name.
Oh, right, okay.
But, he is, again, it's supposed to be, how do we see him? She reads him as a literary character. And I think he likes that. He likes that she sees him as this sort of Hemingway-esque meets, sort of Bronte-esque, hero. He likes that she has that idea of him. So I think he sort of feeds into it. But I think that there are young men that I've encountered who are like him, I suppose, in many ways, where they are... I think the most damning thing that's said about Teddy is where she does sort of have realizations about him every once in a while.
Yes.
And I think, again, that's sort of the older voice coming in and thinking, who was this boy? And she sees him as somebody who is immensely talented, who could be a writer if he wanted to be, who could be a very good writer, but actually, frankly, doesn't want to do any work and will probably piss away his talent through drinking. And she gets that's who he is. And I think that there are, again, even people like Hemingway and Fitzgerald, you could argue, yes, they wrote great novels, but they may have been able to write, more great novels if they hadn't deteriorated their careers. And there, certainly are young men I've met who, they want the lifestyle of being a writer. They want to have that, heroicness about them, but they don't want to do the work that goes into being a writer. And that's a very big difference. And I think that is something that Lily and he have not in common. That Lily, I think, is actually, for as romantic as she is, for as obsessive as she is about the past and about death and how she can sort of go into languors of morbidity, she ultimately will, at the very end of the novel, she ultimately gets up and she gets on with her day. That's what she always does. She is actually somebody who is, perhaps to her own detriment at times, that she keeps on going. But she does keep on going, and Teddy doesn't really seem to be able to do that.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you one or two quick questions before we wrap up, because we're almost out of time on the episode. I heard the rumor essentially that you relocated because of your love for literature. So tell me a little bit about that.
That's a great question. So I grew up really loving English literature, especially Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and Thomas Hardy. So I remember reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles and then Far from the Madding Crowd, and being, I just had to see these places because he evokes landscape in such a way that you have to see it to experience it. Or the bit in Jude the Obscure where Jude sees, the panoply before him of England. So that's kind of when I had the opportunity, when I was in America, to study for a year in England. I had never been abroad in my life. I barely left where I was from. So again, that is an autobiographical feature, I suppose, in the book in many ways. And yes, so I came over, and then I met an Englishman, and I have stayed ever since. I've been here 10 years this year. 10 years this September.
Yeah.
A long time.
Wow.
Go ahead,
Susan, I'd just like to ask a question.
Yes.
If you could recommend, I'd love you to, from all the books, and and also the books you haven't mentioned post 1941, which 3 books would you recommend for someone desperately hungry for literature, having lived in Mars all his or her life? What 3 books would you find the most relevant in literature, out of the top of your head?
That's a really difficult question, especially off the top of my head. There are lots of them. I would say I always go back to Brideshead Revisited by Yvonne Moore.
Oh, it's one of my favorite novels.
It's just gorgeous.
I do find there are some similar themes with Catholic repression and during the Second World War. Okay. Brideshead Revisited by
I love it. I love it thematically, but it's also just the milkiness of the prose. Just you read it and it washes over you, and then you think, oh yes, that is amazing that he did that, those sentences, and you almost start to take for granted how good it is. Another book that I think very much does that for me is Another Country by James Baldwin. Again, it is quite Henry James and its sort of prose and its style, set in the late 1950s in New York. But it is, it could be set today with its modernity and what Baldwin has to say about America and race relations and sexuality. It's an incredible book. Anybody who's not read Baldwin yet, I envy them because they have that to come to still. Oh gosh, and a third one.
Last one, yeah.
Oh gosh, what am I gonna pick? Oh dear, sorry, bear with me because I'm trying to think of things that people may not just like pick up naturally. So I'm not going to say
just off the top of your heart.
As I said, I really, really recommend The Group by Mary McCarthy. I think it is a wonderful book. Not enough people have heard of Mary McCarthy. She was a celebrated American writer in sort of the mid-century, and she wrote this book about young women, as I said, going to university, and then what happens to them in New York. Are they the bright young things that they were supposed to be? And they all have these series of events of disillusionment. It's a very funny book. It's a very acidic book. And if you like books about New York and sort of dark comedy, it's all there. But it's also a really, really great, fantastic story. What's her name?
Right.
The woman who wrote Sex and the City really likes it as well.
Oh, really? Oh my God, okay.
The introduction.
Sterling recommendation. Well, out of those books or any other book, the final question we ask everyone, we're almost out of time, but if you could have written one book, what would it have been?
Oh, that's a fantastic book question. I have a very specific answer. It's a book by an author called Rosamund Lehman. It was her first novel, Dusty Answer. And again, it's a bit like Brideshead. It's set in Cambridge, written in the 1920s. And like Brideshead, there is this homoerotic element to it, except it's with another woman. And it's just a really, really beautiful coming of age story that I don't think enough people have read. I don't think enough people know about Rosamund Lehman. And I read it and I think, like, my God, I think there's some books you read and you think, I would have loved to have written that, but I just don't simply have the talent. Like, I'd love to have written Ulysses, but I couldn't have written Ulysses.
Yeah.
But I read that book and I think, I wish I had just a smidge more talent and could have written that book because it's so in my style. I love everything about it.
And now for the most important question of all, where can people go to get your book?
Oh, yes. So they can get my book at any place where good books are sold. I know that's the usual line. So it's obviously available from Waterstones, Foyles, etc., Blackwell's, or you can go to valleypress.co.uk and order through them. If you sign up for the newsletter, I always know you get a 10% discount. And it's a small press. So direct orders, I think, always do help. Okay,
awesome. Well, Susan, thank you very, very much for joining us.
You just got the book there.
It's a beautiful book cover, by the way. And The Essence of an Hour is it's a beautiful book. Thanks for the copy as well.
Thank you so much for reading it.
And PG, you've got to lend me that one when I visit you this month.
Indeed, yes. Indeed.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We really enjoyed having you on. Have a nice evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Awesome. Well, unexpected as always. We have a lot of unexpected call-ins who always
it's quite a coincidence.
Just perfectly.
It's quite a coincidence, guys. And again, get it. The Essence of an Hour by Susan Ferber. You can get it online under valleypressuk.com. And it's for £12.99, but I believe you do get a discount as was mentioned earlier. Please get it.
Yeah. So we're going to take a 90-second break just to hear an ad for two other great podcasts on the TNC network, and then we'll be back with our recommendations.
Hi, we're the Curiosity of a Child podcast.
I'm Anton, the son.
Age 10, and I'm the daddy.
I'm the daddy. Aged a few multiples of 10.
And we're curious about, well...
everything.
The more you look at the world, the more you understand, and then the more you will see. We're a podcast about history, science, storytelling, and
The curiosity of a child.
we like to dig into different topics, everything from the humble ox.
They've been really important for the development of mankind, and in that episode I had to learn about castration.
Sorry about that. To the most popular Christmas toys of yesteryear. We don't just talk, though. We like to experience. That might mean recording on location a 5,000-year-old dolmen full of spiders and reportedly the entrance to the furry realm.
Or simply tasting spices from across the world to uncover where they came from, how the trade affected people's lives, and how they were used.
So, please listen to the
Curiosity of a Child
Dun Dun
podcast.
Goddamn liberals listen to these podcasts with political authors, politicians, and more.
And in my book, he never accepts any election results.
True. It's funny that because Richard Nixon was in favor of universal basic income, and but his people in his office said you can't be for that. That's going to be called Medicare for all, and it's going to ruin your presidency.
We're Southern born and raised, liberal. We are goddamn liberals, and we have a podcast to talk about it. Join us sometime as we try like hell to keep Georgia blue. Go to gdliberals.com or find us on your favorite platform.
Okay, PJ, do you have a recommendation ready, or would you like me to go first?
I do indeed. We're talking about Paulo Coelho earlier, and I mentioned The Alchemist, so it's got to be mentioned one more time. Please read The Alchemist. It's a great book for self-discovery. Actually, a lot of musicians, for some reason, seem to love this one. I've read and actually talked to musicians, they seem to think it's their favorite book ever.
Wow.
It's really good. Give it a try. Alchemist by Paulo Coelho.
Okay. Mine is Brother in the Land by Robert Swindells. That's an English book from 1984. And it's for teens. Like, I read it when I was 12 or 13. I think it's a little longer than a novella, really, maybe 100 150 pages, something like that. But I don't remember a massive amount about it, but I really remember being impacted by it at that age, because it deals with concepts like war. And in fact, if you ever played like the Fallout games, it's kind of this like nuclear war has devastated the country kind of vibe. And Brother in the Land is because you're burying your brothers in the land, effectively, But the protagonists are all teens, and they're dealing with these difficult themes. And it was one of the earliest kind of times that I had read something that dealt with those kind of themes. So that's what I'm going to recommend for any younger teens like that.
Wow, sounds really interesting.
And my biggest recommendation of all is that everyone go to patreon.com/booksboys and get all our extra shows. Get the Books Boys early, get the Playboys, the Dark Place Dreamers, Poetry Pals, Caper Captains, Renaissance, Games Guys, Music Men, and any other thing you can think of that has alliteration. Forensic Friends, Film Fellows, it's all there.
Awesome, guys.
I think that's pretty much it. If you like us, go to booksboys.com. You'll find links on there to all the different places you can listen to the show, to our social media, Instagram, TikTok, and all the rest of it. Some of our music on Spotify. So there's a whole lot of different things on there. I think that's more or less it. But PJ, in terms of a song to close, well, I used one of mine last time, so it's your turn. And I dug through the archives, and I've come up with two of your songs, and I was going to let you choose which one you'd like to close with.
That's
one is The Hump, and the other is an unnamed, but it's one of the nice little funky numbers that you did with Vincent up in Gran Canaria last Christmas. So I wonder which of those you think is more suitable to close with.
I think Oath was the first one.
Okay,
that's a nice one. I think Sean O'Casey. Well, I would like to think Sean O'Casey might appreciate that one. It's slightly more political, actually. So there you go.
Okay, we'll close with The Hump. So if the DJ would spin that record, and I always say the DJ, and people do not know it's just Alfred. There's no extra
Alfred,
DJ.
yeah.
We're not paying any other additional DJs.
DJ Alfred.
It's just Alfred. That's all he gets paid the big bucks to do.
He's getting all my salary. I have to have a discussion with him about that.
Yeah. And guys, we'll be back in about a month.
All right, guys. See yous.
Just a boy, lost his way too soon. The darkness surrounds me day and night. Deep in my soul, there's a thing called person, and it's surrounded in hatred. I ain't loving your forgiveness, so that's how it goes. Didn't mean to hurt you. Didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't mean to give you away. I didn't mean to exchange you for money and love, fame and hate. Well, Obama said, gotta forgive, so why don't you forgive me? Kissing my forehead and my hair, my rumpin', humpin', come on, it's such fun. You can, so you've got to grab you by your can. But some call me Messiah, some call me Sir Iris, some call me Don Doug, some call me the greatest foe, some call me President, some call me Leopard, some call me Daffodil. Some call me a baddie, some call me a fatty, but I tell you you're the saddest, so come on, simply Betty. Call me the rum, some call me the hum. But I've got the COVID-19. Got to tell Gabriel. No, for this time I've got the porno, I've got the internet, I've Fox News, Jeff Bezos, Alaska, or the machine that creates green cards, Putin, personal collection of Dostoevsky. I own the woman and the children. I own imagination, immigration, immigrants. I own Hollywood, I own a beach bomb, signed by St. Francis of Assisi. Got the COVID-19. Got the COVID-19. Some call me Messiah, some call me the President, some call me a daffodil. Got fuel in my box and it's a present. recently. I lost my woman and my children deep inside of my mind. Is a tower of darkness, and I need my princess to save me out of here. And by my preachers that you should forgive. By my preachers that you should forgive. By my teacher that you've got to forgive. We've got the COVID-19. Got the COVID-19. And the Tower of Babel. Well, just call me the rum, 'cause I'm such fun. Got the COVID-19. Imagination, immigration. My mother left me way too soon. Gave me no love, gave me no magic in my life. So I'm sorry for not being sorry. Sorry for not being sorry.
Books Boys was presented by TheDean and P.J. Burke in association with Thaddeus Penguin Productions. This episode was brought to you by our sponsor,
the Slang vs. Poetry card game.
If you would like to get in touch, you can email us at booksboys@hotmail.com or visit us at booksboys.com. The intro uses Driving in the 70s from the Of Soundtracks and Garage Bands EP by Trapdoor. And the outro uses Dog's Light by Bravo Max from the album of the same name. All music used is either podsafe or used with permission. If you'd like to support the show, go to patreon.com/booksboys, get the show early and all of our bonus Spoof Fan the Boys shows, and you can also check out our music on Spotify or Apple Music. Thank you kindly for listening to us. Please tell your friends, and come back next time for another episode of Books Boys. Read some books!
So PJ, when Susan Ferber went to visit where the Brontes would have been, where Wuthering Heights would have taken place, she was having a lovely time until they told her, it's time for the ghost hunt to start now.